Hello, good evening. Welcome to the Trails Radio Show. Thank you for joining us today. Join me and my special guest, Holocaust survivor, Mr. Nathan Stephen Montrose, in a few minutes. Thanks.
38. Do you want my birth name?
Yes. Yeah.
My birth name is Nathan Stefan Rosenberg, Rozenberg.
Okay.
My mother died when I was 9 months old, and I was raised by my aunt and uncle.
Okay.
And my father would see me each and every day. He would stop by and see me to make sure that I was okay. We lived in a very nice home, and eventually we had to go into the Ghetto, which was an area where all the Jewish people had to live in. It was, I don't know how big it was, maybe 6 square miles, maybe more. I don't know. And it was surrounded by barbed wire, So I remember seeing the barbed wire, and I remember the guards. We went into hiding, and we started living in deserted buildings. And we were found. They pointed rifles at us. They took us to a truck, and the truck took us to a train station. At the train station were the rest of my family, cousins, which I never saw before because I was never let out of the house.
Mm-hmm.
And the train started pulling in, and some people were told to go to the right side of the track, and some were the left side. So the side that we went on was a labor train. So we were put into a cattle car. There were no windows. There were, for toilet facilities, they gave us a bucket. And how many people were in the cattle car, I really don't know. Everybody was standing.
Mm-hmm.
And the toilet bucket, after a while was overflowing. So there was, the urine would go through the cracks, and the feces was all over the place. And my father and my uncles would be holding me. So I went from my father to one uncle to another uncle, backwards and forwards, until the train stopped in the middle of the night, and all the men and the older boys were taken away. And we proceeded on to a camp called Robinsburg.
Mm-hmm.
That was the first camp. So we arrived in Robinsburg. It was in the afternoon. Now, mind you, we had nothing to eat, nothing to drink. And we were met by these ladies that were the capos. And we were deloused in assigned barracks, and was a 3-tier bunk. And I was with my aunt, who I really thought was my mother. Because I never even like my mother, she was dead. So my mother said, I always called her my mother. I always called her mama. And she said she saw rats running around, so she'd take the top bunk. And it was, my mattress was straw. It was infested with fleas and lice and smelled of urine. And I remember falling asleep because we were so tired. And we woke up every morning. They would wake you at 5 o'clock in the morning. It was still dark.
Mm-hmm.
And it wouldn't take roll call until sunlight came. And they would give you a cup of coffee. And the woman went to work. And what I did as a little boy, I really don't remember. Most likely I was always looking for food, like anything, leaves, anything that looked like food. I would, it's like blocked out of my mind. And then at noontime we had our main meal, which was the soup. Soup was pulled down by a couple of cooks. The big bucket came on a trolley. The soup smelled. It was horrible. It was all the leftovers from the Germans that they didn't want to eat was in there. But when you're hungry, you eat anything that's put in front of you. And then the buckets had to be taken back to the kitchen, and there was 2 handles, 1 handle on each side. And I had to fight other little kids and beat them up so I could be on that handle. By being on that handle, I would get to the kitchen and then beg the cook to give us something to eat. And if he gave you a potato, a rotten potato, you were very happy to get that. And along the way, we passed this one building where we heard women screaming and crying. We didn't know what was going on in there, but we just knew it was a bad place. So this went on for months at a time. How long, I really don't know. And then there was a horrible smell in that camp. And to describe the smell, there are no words. It just smelled. I had no idea what was going on. And what it was the crematorium. So they experimented on the people, on the women, and they either gassed them and then they would burn them, the ovens. And it was many, many years after the war that I had that same experience where I smelled that smell, and it was sitting in a dentist chair. And years ago, they didn't have the equipment that they have now. But years ago, if you drilled the dentist was drilling on your tooth, an odor would come up from the tooth, and that is what burning flesh smells like. Now, I didn't have that experience until years after the war. So anyway, from Robinsburg, we were put into a cattle car again, and we were sent to a camp called Caning's Vista House. And there were my uncles and my father, and I finally was able to have contact with my father. And I read the things, and I said, Tata, in Polish, Tata means father. I'm hungry, so he passed me a potato. And if the potato fell on the ground, I didn't care. I would eat it right away. I was so hungry. And then there were my two uncles there, and I would run to my uncles and beg them to give me something to eat. And if I saw any green shrubbery, I would sit down on the ground and start digging. And something told me that there was something to eat on the other end of the green, and it was always a root. And there was no place to wash it, so I would eat it with the sand. Well, what they did to me, they turned me into an animal. I would sit there like an animal. Anyway, one day we had a major roll call, and we all stood together for the first time, and an officer was walking down the line, and as he was coming to the children, he would tap them with a stick, like a baton, like an orchestra leader has. And the children were put into a truck, and my father wanted to take my place. My uncles wanted to take my place, and they said, we're going to go to the camp called Sachsenhausen. And the truck was loaded with kids, and they took us to Sachsenhausen. Why they took us to Sachsenhausen, I didn't know. We arrived in Sachsenhausen, and we were told to stand in front of this one building, and there was a big glass there, and you could see all these different foods hanging, all the different meats, sausages and meat, but you couldn't go over the line. You just look at it. And I was assigned to barracks, and everybody went to different places. And while I was in the barracks one day, there were older men, and they were taking away the floorboards, and they took me along, and I started living underneath the barracks. There was hardly any room to move, very, very little room. And how many days I laid there, I really don't know. Couldn't have been very long, because your system cannot live without water. Mm-hmm. Maybe I was there for 3 days, 2 days, 4 days. I really don't know. But we just heard people yelling and screaming that we're free, we're free. That was April the 30th, 1945. The camp was liberated by the 3rd Russian Army. I was still 6 years old. And they were handing out food. And I couldn't run. I walked very slowly, and I got to them, and they gave me food to eat. And I started eating very, very fast. And I had these horrible pains. And that's all I remember. My uncles were liberated in Canning Vista Housing on April the 30th of 1945, 8 days after me. Mm-hmm. And knew what camp I went to, so they came looking for me. And they couldn't find me anywhere, so they started going through the piles and heaps of dead bodies, and there I was, a skeleton. And I remember, the only thing I remember somebody touching me and moving me. I opened my eye, and I saw my uncle's face, and that's all I remember. And then they took him back to Caning's Vista House, and like I said, I was a skeleton. I had to be nursed back to health. The Russians were very good to us. Most of the time, the Russians didn't like Germans, of course, and they weren't too crazy about the Jewish people either. this commandant took pity on me, and he made sure that my mother, who was really my aunt, but I called her my mother, had a piece of meat every day so she could make soup for me, because the only thing that my stomach or my system could take was soup. And how long I lay there, I really don't know, but eventually I got better. And my uncle said, I should go and thank the commandant, and I did. And he saw me, and he picked me up, and he hugged me, and he said that I could eat with him every day. And so I used to go there every day and eat with him, and he would give me the food, and I didn't know what a knife and fork or spoon were. I would just eat with my hands. I was an animal. And stayed in Catonsville. We stayed there until I was better. Then they gave us 2 horses and a wagon and loaded it with food, and we went back to Poland. And how long it took, I don't know. It was maybe about 350 to 400 miles. So it could have taken us a month before we got to Poland. Mm-hmm. And we went to our home, and the Polish people said, "You get out." So we went to our factory that we owned, and the caretaker, he gave us 1 room, and we waited to see what other members of the family survived. So one day I saw my father walking very slowly. I ran to him, and he was like in a trance. I put his hand in my hand and walked back to the factory. And my father went looking for a little box that he hid, and in it was some jewelry, and loose stones, diamonds, or stuff like that. We came from a very affluent family, and the box was still there. So with some of the stones, he bribed a couple of Russian officers to smuggle us out of Poland back to Germany. And as I'm getting into the truck, I say to my mother, "Mama, why aren't you getting in the truck?" And that's when I'm told that she wasn't my mother. This was my aunt, that my mother was dead. Well, I was very upset. I was angry. I wouldn't talk to my father. And anyway, we proceeded back to Berlin. We were in a DP camp there for a while. And then we went to Hanover, the northern part of Germany. And the reason for that was controlled by the English. And why we went there is because my father's younger brother lived in England. So they reached out for him. And and he came over to visit us. And in 1947, I was 9 years old. I went to London. My father put me on a train. I went to Bremerhaven. Somebody was waiting for me there to put me on a boat. And the next morning, I was in England. And I lived in England, in London. I went to school. I couldn't speak the language. I spoke Polish and German. I didn't speak English, so I had to learn how to speak the language, went to school. My father came to this country in 1948, and now he wants to bring me over. So there was a quota. Only so many Jewish people were allowed. So we changed our name from Robinsburg to Montrose, because that didn't sound Jewish, but it didn't work. I finally was able to come here when I was 14 years of age. That's when we got the papers. My uncle put me on a ship, and I came to the United States. Mm-hmm. I was 14 years of age. I went to school, went to high school, joined the Army in 1957. And I wanted to go to Korea, but they sent me to Germany, which was very hard for me. And then I came back to the States, and I went, from job to job, went to work, and ended up as selling insurance. I was in the insurance business, and got married, didn't have any children, and landed in Florida. I retired, and I came to Florida. With my wife. My wife died 18 years ago. She had cancer.
I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah. I had cancer too, and I survived that. And I meant to tell you that, I forgot to tell you an important part of my life. When I was being smuggled out of Poland back into Germany, from Poland into Germany, the Russians gave me